Okay, here at the entranceway to Rocky River Public Library, we have a very gorgeous piece of Cowan pottery. Really stunning. It's a tile mural that was created by Elsa Vick Shaw in 1930, especially for the Cowan Pottery Studio. Now, Mrs. Shaw was a colleague of R. Cowan's at the Cleveland Institute of Art, and she was primarily a mural painter. But Mr. Cowan convinced her to try her mural skills in the media of ceramics, and so the result was this beautiful tile mural that you see here on an Egyptian theme. Mrs. Shaw was very much of an Egyptologist. The tile mural was a very special piece produced in a very limited edition of 5, and we only know where 3 of the 5 are today. And this is an especially beautiful example, but I have to tell you that it had been damaged, or it had started to disintegrate a little bit, because ever since the library has owned it, back to 1976, there were some missing pieces in the palm tree, in the leaves up at the top, and also the entire bottom border was missing. And at the time that the library was being renovated in 2006, 2007, this seemed like an ideal time to get it restored. And fortunately, we were able to do that with the assistance of the library's Board of Trustees and the museum's affiliate group, the Cowan Pottery Museum Associates. So the result was, it now looks pretty much perfect, and you really can't tell where the original pieces end and the new replacement pieces begin. Directly across from the beautiful tile mural by Elsa Vick Shaw is our first display case of Cowan pottery. It's very close to the entrance, so this is kind of like an introduction to Cowan pottery. And we do have a reproduction of the piece that I was just talking about, the Egyptian Maidens. And this was created by our affiliate group, and it is available for purchase. And it's surrounded by several oversized pieces that are difficult to get into the cases. This is a good place to display them, and I especially want to point out the tall green vase on the left, which was done by R. Cowan very early after his arrival in Cleveland. This was completed in 1910, several years before he had his first studio. Okay, we're approaching the grand reading room, but before we enter that area where most of the Cowan display cases are located, I do want to point out the architectural detail of the building. And you can see that there are 6 large archways here with beautiful dark wood that has been beautifully restored by the architect who was in charge of our recent renovation in 2006, 2007. And this area right here, between the archways, is actually the center of the original library building, which opened in 1928 at the height of the Jazz Age, and also at the height of Cowan pottery's popularity. I always like to bring our visitors to the display case that features the works of R. Cowan first. That makes sense, since Mr. Cowan was the founder and the guiding spirit behind Cowan pottery. And here we see some representative examples of Mr. Cowan's work. And I think you can see that he really had an affinity for the human form, especially the female dancer. Mr. Cowan himself was a beautiful dancer, and his daughter thought that he was the best dancer in the world. And he appreciated fine dancing, and in particular, he loved ballet. And he even took his daughters to see a performance of Anna Pavlova in downtown Cleveland in 1924. And from that experience, he created the Pavlova figure, which you see in the center, the very smallest figure. And these little white figures are all flower frog figurines. The figurine is sitting on top of a little device with holes in it called a flower frog that was used by florists, it still is, for the purpose of assisting with flower arrangement. And Mr. Cowan had the idea of sculpting a figure to put on top of the flower frog and really make a distinctive centerpiece. He patented about 17 different designs, and some of the other artists who worked with him also made flower frog figures and even some animals as well as human figures. So altogether there were almost 30 of these. Now in the center you see a much taller figure, the dancer, which is actually a gray patinated plaster. And this was part of Mr. Cowan's efforts to design some outdoor garden sculpture. And that really didn't take off. Perhaps this figure was just way too delicate. I don't know the reason, but this is a completely unique piece. This dancer figure was often prominently featured in a photograph with Mr. Cowan. You can see it at the back of the case, and that was often at the beginning of the Cowan Pottery catalogs that were published from about 1925 through 1931. But there are also other pieces in this case. The earliest one, down on the bottom shelf, is the 09 vase, which what we call it. It was made in 1909, this dark green vase, sort of in the center on the left. And this vase was made a year after Mr. Cowan arrived in Cleveland. And I think, there's quite a bit of difference between this really early vase and the other vase that I showed you in the entrance case, the tall green vase with the little berries at the top. That was a much more sophisticated work, but yet it was only 1 or 2 years later than this one. Our Logan vase, which was a design that Guy Cowan created in 1924 for the competition at the Chicago Institute of Art known as the Logan Medal, and Mr. Cowan won the Logan Medal that year. The vase was reproduced many times in about 6 different glazes. So there are lots of Logan vases because the initial one won the prize, and it was very successful. And then the figure in the center, called In Holland, was a joint collaboration between Guy Cowan and a prominent Cleveland sculptor of the early 20th century named Herman Matson. So this was done in about 1910, so that's another early piece, but again it was a collaboration with another artist. On the top we have some really distinctive sculptures. Right in the foreground we see Adam and Eve. And what's interesting about this pair is take a close look and you can see that Mr. Cowan has a slightly different version of the story of Adam and Eve, because look at who is giving who the apple. And then in the background on the left, we have his famous Madonna, which took first prize at the Cleveland Museum of Art's May show in 1928, and it was also featured on the museum's catalog for that month. That was a very limited edition of 20 pieces. Okay, we just saw the flower frog figurines in the display case featuring works of our Guy Cowan. And here in this case, featuring the glaze known as Oriental red, there is another flower frog figurine right in the center, the ivory Asian lady. And she is actually not only a flower frog figurine, but she's also a candelabra. So Guy Cowan advanced the idea of the figure on top of the frog and introduced the candelabra aspect as well. And the reason for having her there is because she presents a nice contrast with all of this Oriental red, which is really not what we commonly think of as red. It's more of an orangey color. But that shade, though, is authenticated by the 4 Chinese plates at the back of the top shelf and the third shelf down. And they are the same exact glaze as these ceramic pieces that were made by the Cowan Pottery Studio. So on the top, we also have some other accent pieces. The Korean vase, the ivory Korean vase at the rear was made by our Guy Cowan. And then we have in the foreground of that shelf 3 very cute rounded elephants. And those were created by Margaret Postgate, who was an artist and also a marketing expert who worked for Procter & Gamble, helped to run the soap carving contests that were so famous back in the 20s and 30s. And she first did her elephant sculptures out of bars of ivory soap. And Mr. Cowan asked her to come and try some of this and maybe advance it a little bit with the ceramic medium. But these elephants show first, the largest one is a sculpture, a display piece, and the center one is one of a pair of bookends, and then the last little elephant was meant to be a paperweight. And they are framed by two figures in black known as the pastoral pair. They were created by Wayland Gregory, who was probably the second most prolific artist at the Cowan Pottery studio next to Guy Cowan.